where this proposal comes from. So I'm going to share with you the longer history behind the Uluru Statement from the Heart that you can see on the screen there, and the more contemporary history behind it, to help you understand how we come to this moment. I'm going to talk about its importance throughout that, what it calls for. I'm going to talk about briefly what has happened since it came to be on the 26th of May 2017. And then I'm going to talk about the work ahead of us in the next few months. So I think when we talk about the context of this moment, this map should be familiar to you all. The IATSIS map that shows the hundreds of First Nations in this country. It doesn't only represent First Nations, but it represents hundreds of unique languages. I'm not talking about dialects here, I'm talking about unique languages. And this is important because, different to what I was taught in school and certainly the generations before me, what is said is that we were savages and unintelligent, that we weren't civilized, that white people that came here and invaded our lands were our saviours. And when you look at this map, you look at all the different First Nations, what I want you to understand, I'm sure many of you already do, but what I want to bring home here is that, as experts say, how could these hundreds of unique languages evolve on this common continent, so close to each other, without peace, without a peaceful and abundant existence? There's a word in the Uluru Statement called makarata. Makarata is a Yolngu word for the coming together after a struggle. It's a word for a dispute resolution process. And so our people were a peaceful people comparatively. We understood how to resolve disputes. How else could these so uniquely? And I'm sure you've felt it yourself when you go to that special place and you've felt the beauty and abundance of this country when your breath catches at what you see. How could it be denied that our people enjoyed a peaceful and abundant life? Cook himself, when he came to this country, commented in his journal about what a tranquil life our people were living. A better life than Europeans, he commented on. This is where we should always begin. The states, Queensland, South Australia, Victoria, Tasmania, Western Australia, New South Wales, go the Maroons. The states were the colonies. So the colonies that established themselves here, the British colonies, became the states when we federated as a nation. 1901, the Constitution was made. In the late 20th century, there was the constitutional dialogues. All white men, no women, no First Nations people at the table. They negotiated the terms of federation, and what you see on the screen here now is the race power, section 5126. A lot of Australians are unaware of this part of our Constitution. They know more about the Constitution of the United States than the Australian Constitution. It's one of the challenges that we have. But the race power in the Constitution, you can see some, you might not be able to, but there's some red words there. Power in the Constitution excluded Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. What the race power is the power for the federal parliament to make special laws about a race of people. What this can tell you is with certainty that our Constitution is racist. It also Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the census as Australian citizens. So it excluded us as Australian citizens. And the 1967 referendum changed those two things. And the words in red, the exclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, were removed to give the power to the federal parliament to make special laws about Indigenous people as well. Now, that didn't mean that laws couldn't be made about Indigenous people in this country. What it meant is that that power rested with the states. And the states, in particular this state, were cruel and negligent to Indigenous people. We were starved on missions and reserves. They had complete control over our lives. There were policies of forced assimilation. For my people in the Torres Strait, that in the late 20th century, before the Constitution and the Federation of Australia, they had bought luggers, had loans to buy luggers. They worked on those luggers, they paid them off, they were fishing on their own terms, providing for their communities. And when the White Australia policy came in, the first act of the Federal Parliament of Australia, they confiscated those luggers and forced our people to work on those luggers for rations. These are the sort of things that happened. And so the states, being particularly cruel, our elders back in the day fought for these changes because they saw it as an important incremental step for our people. That those cruel states should lose that power and the federal parliament take it. They were seen as more benevolent, and also it was important for moving things federally, advancing our rights and interests. So that was changed, as well as that exclusion of being counted. And after Federation, for many decades after, this wasn't a colonial times thing, the frontier wars and the massacres and those cruelties. For decades after Australia came to be, these policies continued and were in fact strengthened, as I said, with the White Australia policy. Massacres continued for decades. Now, let's talk about the longer history of the Uluru Statement a little more. The Uluru Statement is one of many statements and petitions. You can see here is a petition to the King. William Cooper and the leaders of the time made this petition. I'll just mention several. Yirrkala Bark petitions, 1963. Yolngu people trying to protect country. Federal government was moving to excise a massive portion of their country to a mining company, Comalco. 1972, the Larrakia petition to the Queen. Now, in common for these statements and petitions, as with others, they all called for a voice or political representation. And they were all dismissed and ignored. This one here, a bit different, the Barunga Statement, 1988. Bob Hawke was the Prime Minister at the time. If you can see that picture, he's shaking the late great Yunupingu's hand. Barunga is a small Aboriginal community near Katherine in the Northern Territory. The Barunga Statement again called for a voice. It also called for a national treaty. Bob Hawke promised both of those things. He failed to deliver on the treaty. This nation, unlike like nations, does not have a treaty. We're behind. On the voice, and he established the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission. Now, another pattern throughout the history of our struggle is that we have established voices many times before. We didn't wait for governments to do this, as human groups do, as you're doing here. People with a common interest come together, choose representation, reach consensus on our priorities, and then coherently take it forward with some strength because of that process. So we've done that. The 1920s, they say, was the first all-Aboriginal political organisation, Australian Aboriginal Progressive Association, led by a fellow wharfie. I was a wharfie for 16 years before I got into this stuff. Although I was active during my time on the wharf. We're socially progressive and militant, I'm hearing a lot in the papers lately, because I'm still a union official. But Fred Maynard, a Warramai man, was the leader of that organisation. And those voices that you see at the top of that page were silenced by intimidation. The powers that be could steal our children legally, direct us to work without pay, exile us from country, decide who we could marry, complete control over our lives. They used those powers to intimidate the leaders, to silence the ones towards the bottom of that page, such as the National Aboriginal Consultative Committee, National Aboriginal Conference, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission. They were set up by benevolent governments that we were able to convince to give us a say. And they were defunded, ignored, and always silenced by a government that came along after the one that established it. So, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, that's what... And those that were watching politics in those times, you didn't have to watch it, you couldn't miss it. John Howard, you'd know about what John Howard said about ATSIC. John Howard was in opposition when Hawke established ATSIC. He vehemently opposed it, and as soon as he won power, he went about silencing that voice just like all those others, following that pattern. He didn't celebrate the great work that ATSIC was getting done. It was doing some good things. He amplified its problems. He set up a review, appointed 2 conservatives and Auntie Jackie Huggins, a third person inquiring into ATSIC. And I wrote, Kathy Wilcox is a great political cartoonist, that arrow always points to hostile eventually. And whatever we establish, they take away. Your voice, what happens? You're exploited, you're easily ignored, you're easily divided, you're degraded, you can't take your interests forward in a coherent way. ATSIC was shut down by 2005, and then we saw the Northern Territory intervention. A Prime Minister, leader of this entire nation, basically stepping up to a podium and announcing to the entire country that the problems in our communities, child abuse and domestic violence, were an Aboriginal problem that deserved the disgraceful acts that he did. Suspended the Racial Discrimination Act to do it, that's how racist it was. Moved the Australian Army in against the most vulnerable communities in this country. Disempowered us, and we know for millions and millions of dollars, if not billions, when you put it all together, took us backwards. Things were made worse. I'll never forget Tony Abbott, when he was Prime Minister, cut hundreds of millions of dollars from frontline community services. You probably felt the impact, a lot of people in this room. Defunding healing organisations, programs. And you look at the repercussions today in our communities, things in a lot of our communities got worse. Those kids with FASD needed those services. Our people needed legal support. All of these things. Repercussions for these decisions that happen too easily when the people don't have a voice. In 2015, because the gap was widening, 39 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders demanded a meeting of the Prime Minister and opposition leader. It was Abbott and Shorten at the time. They had this meeting and they made the Kirribilli Statement. The Kirribilli Statement said 2 things that are important to this moment. Firstly, that when it comes to constitutional recognition that had been in the national discourse for some time by then, we don't want merely symbolic recognition, just some poetic words that recognise our existence. They said we want a substantive form of recognition that gives greater fairness to our people. And secondly, they said that we understand that these meetings can happen and nothing. I learned that this was a unique opportunity. So well resourced, so well formulated. And so we came together at Uluru and we did the hard work. And no more than all of the people in this room would agree to any particular topic, pretty much. We couldn't all agree either. That has been done. And consider the Uluru Statement. I'm going to recite it now. We gathered at the 2017 National Constitutional Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, make this statement from the heart. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did according to the reckoning of our culture from the creation, according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion. The ancestral tie between the land or Mother Nature and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom remain attached thereto and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished, and it coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise? That a people's possessed the land for 60 millennia and this sacred link disappears from world history in merely the last 200 years? With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Proportionately, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not an innately criminal people. Our children are alien from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of our powerlessness. We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish, they will walk in two worlds, and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. In 1967 we were counted. In 2017 we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country. We invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. That's the Uluru Statement. As I said, if you're voiceless, you're easily divided, degraded, ignored. We must re-establish a voice. But we must learn from what happened to previous voices that did great work. Government always came along and silenced it. The Constitution is the rule book of the nation. Even the politicians have to follow it. Remember Section 44? Politicians losing their jobs. Some didn't even know they had, another, nationality and things like that. That's how strong the Constitution is. The Parliament can't change it on their own. They can't get rid of a voice when it's in there because the Australian people put it there. That's the idea of enshrining it in the Constitution. It also gives this voice great power in that it says to all future parliaments that they need to listen to this voice and they need to act on what it says is important to our communities. It needs to listen to the solutions. It's the Australian people saying, do what Indigenous people say is best in their communities. Stop ignoring them. It also calls for a Makarrata Commission, a process of agreement making and truth-telling that can be legislated any time. Our focus right now is on the voice because the strategy talked about at Uluru is that you establish a representative body and then you get the best results for the Makarrata Commission that furthers the work that is already happening on treaty and truth-telling. It's already happening, those things. We need a voice to take it further in a more powerful way. So, Turnbull, if you remember, as predicted, the Coalition dismissed the Uluru Statement from the heart almost immediately. But you see, we considered this lesson as well, that lesson of all those statements and petitions ignored. We wrote the Uluru Statement not to a king or a queen or a parliament, we wrote it to the Australian people. And so we refused to take no for an answer from Turnbull and Morrison. And now we've got Abbott in. Not far out. I did that the other day too. God help us. Now we have from Abbott in power. The Labor Party, and that took hard work in itself, I've got to tell you. I followed Albo and others around with the Uluru Statement, rolling it out at their barbecues and that, and a little eye roll, I'll use Thomas again. We did the work. to take the Uluru Statement to the people. We convinced the ALP to make it policy. I was entrusted with the canvas and travelled around for 2 years with it and haven't stopped since. 6 years I've been working on this now. And took it to the people, and we've built a people's movement. And Albo committed to the Uluru Statement in full. Now that is a unique opportunity in itself. We have a federal parliament, a federal government, committed to voice, treaty and truth. It's pretty rare. We've got to make the most of this. And a voice is important. So, we are going to referendum later this year, as I said. I believe it'll be mid-October, it'll be announced soon. That means that we are almost only 100 days away from it. Only a few months, 16 weeks, less than 16 weeks I think it is. This is urgent. I'm here asking you to take action and to make this a priority among the other great work that you do. You can do more than one thing at once, but we've got to make this a priority. We've got to win Queensland. Screen here. We don't just need a majority of Australians, we need a majority of states as well. 4 out of 6 states need to vote yes, and you guys are in the toughest state. The most successful referendum was that 67 referendum. 91.8% voted yes. It had bipartisan support. We don't have that, even though we worked hard for it. We did our best because we knew it was something that could help. But Peter Dutton, to his eternal shame, I'm sure, has taken the decision to use this as a political football, as has been done so many times with our lives, and to go against it. And we see lies, we see disinformation, we see tactics of causing fear and confusion. But we can beat it. This is the question that we'll be answering. A proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Simple question. The answer is yes. What? Yes. That's right. This is what will happen in the Constitution. These words will be inserted. There are only 93 words. A new Chapter 9, Section 129. In recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia, 1, there shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. 2, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice may make representations to the Parliament and Executive Government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And 3, the Parliament shall, subject to the Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice, including its composition, functions, powers and procedures. Now that first bit, not highlighted here, it's recognition that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, our First Nations, Indigenous peoples, the word has, whatever term you use in law, it's the same thing. That we have always been here as the first peoples and we continue to be here. It recognises our existence. The first part there just establishes a guarantee that we will have a voice. The second part guarantees that we can make representations to the Parliament and Executive Government. Now we have had to, as leaders, I was involved in negotiating these words. They tried to convince us to remove Executive Government. Executive Government just means the ministers and the heads of department, the Cabinet. And we said no, we need a guarantee to be able to give advice, to influence the decisions that the Executive is making. Because by the time a policy or law reaches the Parliament, the deal's already been done. Our people in our communities need to be at the inception of the making of policies and laws. We need to shape them from the beginning, not when the deal's already been done and it's passing through Parliament. And on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, you'll hear this argument, that's too broad. Indigenous people are going to want to have a say about where the submarines are parked or what parking fine tickets are. Well, maybe that would be a good thing. But geez, like our voice, like that is accountable to our people in our communities, that is representing our best interests, like it's going to waste its time on talking about submarines. You know, this is an elected body. You won't last as a representative for long. You'd lose all credibility. We're going to talk about health and housing and programs and services, issues that are common to all of our communities, like housing, like the justice system. We can take forward better as a collective, and that's all this does. Just because it's advisory doesn't mean it's powerless. I'll say that too, because some people say, oh, if it's just advisory, they're just going to ignore it. Well, I'll tell you what, in the first 48 hours from when the Uluru Statement was made, Barnaby Joyce went out and said it's going to have too much power. It'll be a third chamber to Parliament. It'll have a right to veto. So if it's not advisory to Parliament, that's what it is. And he said that because he knows it'll never succeed if we ask for that. He knows Australians would be afraid of us having that sort of power. Advisory isn't powerless because it's that power of unity. It's a power of representatives that we hold to account, unlike now. We have politicians, Indigenous politicians, chosen to speak for us, that represent their electorate and their party's interests. The Country Liberal Party Senator Price doesn't represent our interests. We should be able to choose people that speak for us on issues that are common across our communities that we can agree on. And that's important. This last part basically says that the Parliament decides the model. So how many people are elected? Is it 24 representatives? Is it 30? How they're chosen? What the regions are? Is it like the old ATSIC regions? It was 36, I think, regions. Those types of things. And the reason why the Parliament should be able to decide that is because you need flexibility on those things. You can't put all of that in the Constitution because then it'll become set in stone. You need to be able to improve the organisation like ATSIC should have been able to improve, and our other representative bodies. So that's, but importantly, subject to the Constitution. So it cannot take away from 1 and 2 that there shall be a voice and it can make representations. It guarantees us a voice to make representations in our own right. There's also design principles. I encourage you to look them up, answer some of the questions about what this looks like. That the voice will be chosen by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people based on the wishes of our communities. One of the ones that isn't up there, is that after the referendum passes, there'll be a process of consultation in our communities about the model itself. So the government will hear from us about the final shape of the voice, which again, we can advocate to improve over time. Won't have a program delivery function like ATSIC did. We've got service providers nowadays. This will be on policies and laws and connecting the dots on what we need to move forward on. It won't have a veto power, accountable and transparent, work alongside existing organisations and traditional structures, won't undermine or override them. So that is what we are voting on. You'll hear the argument about detail, you just heard it all. Okay, we're voting on firstly, if we should be recognised, 1 with a voice, and 2 with the ability to make representations, yes or no, right? It's a no-brainer. We should be saying yes. But we're up against it. There is this campaign that is full of lies, disinformation. They're coming after me personally, and other leaders that they think are effective, but they always do that with blackfellas that put their head up. And we're going to beat them. And it puts a fire in my belly. You know what else puts a fire in my belly? Is I want to see you guys and my communities and my children smiling on the TV screen the day after a referendum. I don't want to see Pauline Hanson and Peter Dutton celebrating on that TV screen. That's what's at stake. We're going to a referendum. We're going to a referendum. And we need to make sure we win. So that's the Yes23 website. You can volunteer on there. There's an event in Brisbane here on the 2nd of July. Register for that today. So when you go, you'll get a free t-shirt. We've got to get that visibility out there. The next time I see you guys on the street, I want to see you wearing Yes shirts and all the rest. That movement for this, we are running out of time and we can win it. I'll just leave you with that. We can win it because earlier this year, the numbers in the polling were over 60%. Since the disinformation and lies have been strong and all of that fear-mongering, it's gone down to around 50%. Our polling shows us still ahead, different to the polls that have been published by News Corp. We're still ahead, 55 to 45, around that. But we've got to work hard to turn this around. It is trending down. So do the work like we did and let's win. Thank you.